It's a pretty basic expectation of horror movies that most victims have a decent idea of what's happening to them, whether being pursued by a masked slasher or battling a supernatural presence in their home. Yet some adventurous filmmakers like to toy with conventions in order to challenge audiences by centering their movies around characters who, believe it or not, aren't quite aware they were victims all along. Now, we do already have a video on this very topic, so be sure to check that one out first, but with that in mind, I'm Ellie with What Culture here with 10 more horror movie characters who didn't know they were the victim. Number 10. Marion Harrington in Dead End. Dead End takes place on Christmas Eve as Frank Harrington drives his family to his in-laws' home and, out of apparent boredom, decides to take a shortcut through a remote forest area. Already, why? That's such a bad idea. Later, Frank falls asleep at the wheel and very nearly crashes the car into an oncoming vehicle, after which the family finds themselves trapped on a seemingly never-ending road. Throughout the rest of the movie, the family end up being brutally killed one by one while experiencing a bevy of bizarre sights, including a hearse driving down the road. Only Frank's daughter Marion is left alive at film's end, and surprise surprise, she subsequently wakes up in a hospital where it's revealed that she's been in a coma after her father crashed their car, in turn killing every other member of the family. And so, the gruesome deaths suffered by the family members throughout the movie precisely mirror how they died in the actual car crash. Granted, a credit stinger does cast some doubt on what's truly real, given that a note Frank wrote during Marion's comatose dream is recovered from the road in real life, suggesting it wasn't entirely cooked up by Marion's brain. All the same, Marion had no earthly idea what was happening to her until she finally woke up in that hospital. Number 9. Stack, Ball and Bulldog in Tales from the Hood. Cult fave horror comedy anthology Tales from the Hood is framed by a story of 3 drug dealers, Stack, Ball and Bulldog, arriving at a funeral home to purchase drugs from its unnerving owner, Mr. Sims. Sims then guides the trio through the funeral home to the morgue where the drugs are stored, all while telling stories of some of the corpses in the building. 4 tales later, we finally learn the truth. The 3 men were responsible for killing the subject of one of the stories, a gangster called Crazy K. The trio become agitated as Sims makes it clear he knows what they've done, and when they threaten to kill him, he leads them to 3 caskets, revealing their own corpses inside. Yep! Stack, Ball and Bulldog were actually dead this whole time, as Crazy K's associates killed them in revenge for his murder. More to the point, the funeral home is really hell, and Mr. Sims is actually Satan, who leaves them to burn for all eternity. So, while they absolutely got the ball rolling here by killing Crazy K, they're still unknowing victims in their own right too. Number 8. Taylor in Behind the Mask, The Rise of Leslie Vernon. Behind the Mask, The Rise of Leslie Vernon is a terrific horror mockumentary in which journalist Taylor and her crew follow an aspiring serial killer, Leslie Vernon, as he prepares to embark on a rampage he hopes will put him firmly on the map. Leslie plans out his killing spree to match the conventions of slasher movies, to the extent that his piece de resistance is a showdown with the final girl, a virgin named Kelly. Taylor and her crew ultimately have a crisis of conscience on the night of the massacre and attempt to stop him, knowing the full extent of his plan, or so they think. However, it turns out that Leslie bait and switched them, as Kelly is soon revealed to not be a virgin and therefore not the final girl, moments before she's brutally killed. Taylor then announces that she herself is a virgin, revealing her to be the real final girl as Leslie intended all along. Though in fairness, Leslie's plan always involved him eventually being killed by Taylor, as he is at the end, albeit not before thoroughly terrorizing her. Number 7. The Strangers in the Vault of Horror. 1973's cult British horror anthology film The Vault of Horror follows 5 men who end up trapped in the basement of an office building with seemingly no means of escape. While waiting for help, the gents sit down, pour some drinks, and each regale the group with a tale of a recurring nightmare. Each of the stories play out, and then we return to the men for an epilogue in which the lift door, which has been closed the entire movie, opens, leading out into a graveyard. 4 of the men enter the graveyard and promptly disappear, before the remaining one, Sebastian, reveals that they're actually damned souls whose punishment involved telling the stories, not nightmares, of their evil acts for all of eternity. And at that moment, Sebastian turns back to the room the men were trapped in, revealing it to have been a mausoleum all along. It's an awful fate for anyone, no matter how heinous their acts, but at least they get to drink while reliving their torment nightly, right? Number 6. John Baxter in Don't Look Now. Don't Look Now is one of the greatest horror films of all time, as married couple John and Laura Baxter head to Venice while grieving the accidental drowning death of their daughter. Once they arrive, two elderly clairvoyants inform them that their daughter is attempting to warn them that John is in danger. John, meanwhile, begins witnessing strange, surreal visions, such as a small figure wearing the same red coat his daughter wore when she died, and Laura on a boat that's part of a funeral parade, despite the fact that Laura wasn't even in Venice at this point. At the end of the movie, John again sees the red-coated figure and follows them, after which they're revealed to not be a child, but a dwarf. More to the point, they're the serial killer who has been mentioned to be terrorizing Venice, who then mortally wounds John with a meat cleaver. As John dies, he realizes that his visions were actually premonitions of his own murder and funeral, and that he was the victim all along. Number 5. Duke Desmond in Salvage. Salvage follows Claire, a young woman who is brutally murdered by a man named Duke. At that moment, Claire wakes up at the convenience store where she was working prior to being killed, causing her to initially believe that she experienced a nightmare. Except Claire is eventually murdered again, forcing her to realize that she's trapped in a loop of experiencing her own death at Duke's hand. But at film's end, we're given the full context for this. For starters, Duke has not only killed Claire, but also her boyfriend Jimmy. And more to the point, Duke Desmond has actually been killed by the police and sent to hell, where his soul has since been inhabiting Claire's body, forced to relive her murder at his own hands for eternity as punishment. That's like really messed up, even for a vicious murderer. Number 4. Everyone in DEATHWATCH. DEATHWATCH is a rare war horror film taking place in the middle of World War I as a squad of British soldiers find themselves trapped behind enemy lines. The unit becomes lost in a fog-like haze before witnessing an increasingly bizarre and unsettling series of sights, such as compasses and watches no longer working, demonic growls in the distance, and corpses coming back to life. Clearly something untoward is in the German trenches beyond their mere battlefield enemies, and given that HQ announces over the radio that they believe the unit to have been killed in action, it's not that hard to see where things are going. Though the film's elliptical ending doesn't spell it out, it's a common reading that the British soldiers are all dead and have effectively been in purgatory for most of the movie, the content of their character being tested by their actions throughout the story. As for the German soldier who met the Brits at the start of the film and greets another batch of British soldiers at the end, he's often interpreted as a god or judge-like figure testing the soldiers. Either way, when the British soldiers entered those foggy German trenches, they had no idea what they'd presumably already suffered through. Number 3. Scarlett and Chad in Farmhouse. Psychological horror Farmhouse centers around a young married couple, Scarlett and Chad, who moved to Seattle following financial strife and the death of their infant son. While driving, however, Chad falls asleep and crashes their car, leaving them stranded in the middle of nowhere near a, you guessed it, farmhouse. The farmhouse's owners, Sam and Lilith, allow Scarlett and Chad to stay the night, only to attack them and reveal that they plan to torture and kill them. Scarlett and Chad fight back, however, and eventually kill their captors before fleeing the farmhouse in Sam's pickup truck. When the truck runs out of gas and they take off on foot though, they inexplicably end up back at the farmhouse. Here, they're confronted by a miraculously still alive Sam and Lilith, who reveal that Scarlett and Chad died in their initial car crash and are now in hell. Satan then shows up and confirms that the couple are being punished for killing their son in order to collect life insurance money and pay off Chad's debts. Well, that's bleak. Satan does, however, do the pair a rather undeserved solid by giving them a second chance to, not murder their own son. However, the ending leaves it ambiguous as to whether or not they actually try raising him this time. If not, they'll be seeing Satan again soon enough. Number 2. Philip Goodman in Ghost Stories. In Ghost Stories, skeptical Professor Philip Goodman is asked to investigate 3 supposedly real supernatural incidents. At the culmination of these 3 stories, we learn that Goodman is actually hospitalized, suffering from locked-in syndrome after a botched suicide attempt in his car. Basically, the 3 stories were all concocted by Goodman's consciousness from staff members and objects in his hospital room, usual suspect style, as well as his own guilt-riddled childhood, where he failed to save a tormented mentally disabled boy who died of an asthma attack. Ultimately, the doctors believe Goodman to be in a fully vegetative state, with no understanding of his surroundings, which evidently isn't true. The stories represent his brain's attempts to process both his guilt and what has happened to him, while not strictly acknowledging that he's actually confined to a hospital bed forevermore. Number 1. Gretchen and Jack in REEKER. In REEKER, a group of young adults end up stranded in a desert oasis while being pursued by a grotesque, decaying creature. What initially appears to be a pretty typical down and dirty slasher flick eventually reveals itself to be more complicated than that though, when the ending reveals that the central characters were involved in a car crash which killed most of them. Earlier in the film, the group experienced a tremor on the road, and this actually marked the point at which their car was hit by an RV, killing all of the occupants except for Gretchen and Jack. From the tremor onward, the rest of the movie is effectively set in purgatory between the moment of the crash and the deaths of those on board, as the REEKER attempts to re-inflict the injuries from the car crash on the victims again, in turn confirming their deaths in the real world. And to top it all off, in the final scene, neither Gretchen nor Jack, who are now recovering from their injuries, have any memory of the accident or of their time in limbo. And that concludes our list. Let us know your thoughts in the comments down below, and while you're there, don't forget to like and subscribe and tap that notification bell. Also, head over to Twitter and follow us there, and I can be found across various social medias just by searching Ellie Littlechild. I've been Ellie with What Culture. I hope you have a magical day, and I'll see you real soon.